Welcome to our screencast on some background about the Salem witch trials, which will give you some context for reading or viewing Arthur Miller's The Crucible. Let's start off with a pretest. If you dare, try to answer the following questions. When did the witch trials start? In what ways were witches executed? What caused the end of the witch trials? What is HUAC? And what was Senator McCarthy's Black Book? By the end of the screencast, you'll be able to answer all of these questions, as well as have all the necessary information to understand Arthur Miller's The Crucible. Let's start off with a quick video which will give us some background about what the Salem witch trials actually were.
You've been accused of a crime you did not commit. It's impossible to prove your innocence. If you insist that you're innocent anyway, you'll likely be found guilty and executed. But if you confess, apologize, and implicate others for good measure, you'll go free. Do you give a false confession or risk a public hanging? This was the choice facing those accused of witchcraft in the village of Salem, Massachusetts, between February 1692 and May 1693. They were the victims of paranoia about the supernatural, misdirected religious fervor, and a justice system that valued repentance over truth. Salem was settled in 1626 by Puritans, a group of English Protestants. Life was strict and isolated for the people of Salem. Battles with their Native American neighbors and groups of French settlers were commonplace. People feared starvation and disease, and relations between villagers were strained. To make matters worse, 1692 brought one of the coldest winters on record. That winter, two cousins, 9-year-old Betty Paris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, started behaving very strangely. A physician found nothing physically wrong, but diagnosed the girls as under an evil hand. Puritans believed that the devil wreaked havoc in the world through human agents, or witches, who blighted nature, conjured fiendish apparitions, and tormented children. As news swept through the village, the symptoms appeared to spread. Accounts described 12 so-called afflicted girls contorting their bodies, having fits and complaining of prickling skin. 4 of the girls soon accused 3 local women of tormenting them. All 3 of the accused were considered outsiders in some way. On February 29th, the authorities arrested Sarah Good, a poor pregnant mother of a young daughter, Sarah Osborne, who had long been absent from church and was suing the family of one of her accusers, and Tituba, an enslaved woman in Betty Paris's home known by her first name only. Tituba denied harming the girls at first, but then she confessed to practicing witchcraft on the devil's orders, and charged Good and Osborne with having forced her. Osborne and Good both maintained their innocence. Osborne died in prison, while Good's husband turned against her in court, testifying that she was a witch or would be one very quickly. Good's 4-year-old daughter was imprisoned and eventually gave testimony against her mother. Meanwhile, Good gave birth in jail. Her baby died, and she was convicted and hanged shortly thereafter. Tituba was held in custody until May and then released. These 3 victims were just the beginning. As accusations multiplied, others, like Tituba, made false confession to save themselves. The authorities even reportedly told one accused witch that she would be hanged if she did not confess and freed if she did. They were not particularly interested in thoroughly investigating the charges. In keeping with their church's teachings, they preferred that the accused confessed, asked for forgiveness, and promised not to engage in more witchcraft. The court accepted all kinds of dubious evidence, including so-called spectral evidence, in which the girls began raving when supposedly touched by invisible ghosts. Complicating matters further, many of the jurors in the trials were relatives of the accusers, compromising their objectivity. Those who dared to speak out, such as Judge Nathaniel Saltonstall, came under suspicion. By the spring of 1693, over 100 people had been imprisoned, and 14 women and 6 men had been executed. By this time, accusations were starting to spread beyond Salem to neighboring communities, and even the most powerful figures were targets. When his own wife was accused, the governor of Massachusetts colony suspended the trials. Sentences were amended, prisoners released, and arrests stopped. Some have speculated that the girls were suffering from hallucinations caused by fungus, or a condition that caused swelling of the brain. But ultimately, the reason for their behavior is unknown. What we do know is that adults accepted wild accusations by children as hard evidence. Today, the Salem witch trials remain a cautionary tale of the dangers of groupthink and scapegoating and the power of fear to manipulate human perception. Weaponized accusations of witchcraft were around for millennia before reaching the village of Salem. Travel to the ancient city of Alexandria and follow the tragic story of Hypatia, a renowned scholar and political advisor brought down by a charge of witchcraft.
So just to rehash a couple of the key things. The Salem witch trials occurred in Salem, the city just north of Boston, in 1692. And in the beginning, it was January 1692 when the young girls fell ill. The doctors claimed that they were bewitched. And in February of 1692, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne were accused of witchcraft. Now the hysteria begins, as was stated in the cartoon, and it's important to know that Tituba and the other individuals at first were outsiders. Tituba was an enslaved woman from Barbados who was a servant in Paris's house, and she was the first accused and actually the first to confess. Now, Reverend Paris was a local minister, the father of Betty, the uncle of Abigail. He'll play a major role in Arthur Miller's The Crucible. Then, as the trials went on, poor began accusing rich, and there became social battles of jealousy and power, and people with personal grievances began to air them out through the court system. The mood and atmosphere was tense. Again, as was stated in the video, over 150 people were arrested, and the summer of 1692 began the executions. The irony being that if one confessed to being a witch, that person was granted life. If one denied being a witch, that person was executed. Here are some photos of the court trials. You can see some of the accused were very elderly. On the left-hand side is a girl who's writhing on the ground, a victim of spectral evidence. Here you see the judges looking at evidence, and the spectral evidence was absolutely ridiculous. It consisted of sometimes birthmarks on an individual, wild testimony that had no basis in fact, but was accepted by the courts. Now, in terms of the process of judging, people would look for witch marks. If dead bodies bled, that meant that they were witches. Witch marks involved birthmarks. Witch cakes were cakes made of the urine of accused witches, and if dogs refused to eat them, that meant that that was the urine of a witch. And the assumption was that one was guilty until proven innocence. The idea of spectral evidence gave much power to the accusers because there was actually nothing factual about that. The accused had no lawyers, and the young girls actually had quite a bit of power, which, as you know from Puritan culture, would have been different than the norm. Here's a picture of a woman being hanged. Now, the end of the trial started when Governor Phipps's wife was accused. Again, poor individuals in the community began accusing those with power, and Governor Phipps basically said that you cannot use spectral evidence to get a conviction. In September of 1692, just about a year and a half after the hysteria began to wane. On the right-hand side, you see a witch trial memorial, and if you go to Salem today, there are many different mementos and memorials dedicated to preserving the memory and the lessons of this important event. The judges, except Judge Staunton, said they were sorry, and you may remember from the Nathaniel Hawthorne video that Judge Hathorne was one of the judges and also Nathaniel's ancestor, the reason he added the W to his name to try to escape that relation. The results of the trials involved 19 people hanged on Gallow Hill. One person was pressed to death. You'll find out why when you see the crucible. And 4 of the accused died in jail waiting to be tried. 2 dogs were killed too. They were witch dogs. Now, how did this happen? Well, if you imagine the Puritans were trying to build a city on a hill, and the fear was real: disease, death, assault by Native American raids, the ruin of a culture that meant not just the ruin of their society, but that God's hand was not upon them. And for the misfortune in their community, they would blame the devil, whom we know from the Scarlet Letter lives in the forest. And the devil uses witches in order to corrupt the society. So the Puritans feared the witches that would infiltrate their world and bring down their society to ruin. The reasons for this could have been maybe fear of change, and old versus new economies, changes in social values, changes in the role of women, the presence of fear, this idea that one should search for invisible enemies within the community as threats to the very well-being. And there's also this attempt to demonize the enemy, not just name the enemy, but say that the enemy is monstrous. Think back to Anne Hutchinson and her miscarried babies. And then most importantly, this idea of no due process. All right, history repeating itself. Arthur Miller's writing his play in the 1950s, and even though it's set in the Puritan time, he's actually writing about contemporary events, particularly surrounding the Red Scare. Now, the Red Scare revolved a political atmosphere in the 1950s, which reflected post-World War II tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, known as the Cold War, an escalation of a buildup of weapons and rhetoric in which one side was pitted against the other, which led to a distrust, fear, hatred of communists in the United States. Now, as you know, the Communist Party is a legal party in the United States, but during this time, it became emotionally connected to the outsiders, the evil USSR, almost the devil. Think back. The city, or Americans, still see themselves as a city on a hill. We hear that rhetoric in politics all the time. And the fear in the 1950s was real. There was political unrest, fear that the atom bomb would come and create the ruin of a culture. And we blamed the USSR, and not only just as a political enemy, but associate them with a moral depravity, the devil. But what does this contemporary devil use? Not witches, but communists, who would infiltrate the city on a hill and bring down its ruin. So you may see some parallels with what was going on in Puritan society. Now, Senator Joseph McCarthy was born in 1908. He exploited the fears about the Soviet Union and the unrest that was present in the United States by proclaiming that communists were present in America and wanted to bring down society. Now, many think that he was using this argument in order to discredit his political opponents. He held up a black book and said, in this black book, this very black book, I have the names of 200 plus individuals who are known communists who are trying to bring down our wonderful United States. Now, brief history of HUAC. We've had the House of Un-American Activities Committee since 1938. It was established by U.S. Representative Samuel Dixon, and it was meant to try to ferret out people who were acting against the United States. It accused during the 1950s actors, directors, producers, screenwriters, even educators and professors as communists, as people acting not in the best interest of the United States. These individuals were blacklisted, which meant that they could not be hired and they lost their jobs. Now, if you were suspected of being a communist, you would be brought before the Committee of House on Un-American Activities. If you were a friendly witness, if you admitted to being a communist and named others, you were not under suspicion, you were treated with respect, you were allowed to read pre-composed answers. You may recognize some of the pictures of individuals who were friendly witnesses. Very similar to the Salem witch trials, if one confessed and named names, one was let go. If one refused to confess, the consequences were dire. Unfriendly witnesses, who include Lillian Hellman and Ring Lardner, a great short story writer, including also the Hollywood 10, refused to name names, refused to admit to being part of the Communist Party. They were blacklisted and unemployed in Hollywood for years. In fact, there's several famous movies that have come out about this. Lillian Hellman famously stated, "I cannot and will not cut my conscience to fit this year's fashions." Now, much of the evidence was very similar to the spectral evidence, and this political cartoonist is making fun of Joseph McCarthy's doctored photos and fake letters. There really was no evidence to say that individuals were working to bring down the United States and bring down or create political upheaval. Again, like the Salem witch trials, it was based on misinformation. fake news. Well, how did it end? Well, one of the reporters, a very famous reporter in the 1950s, Edward R. Murrow, created a See It Now broadcast in which he actually broadcast the hearings, and people were able to see how ridiculous they were with no evidence, no due process, no way of proceeding that was fair for individuals who were accused of being a communist. In fact, Senator Welch said to Joseph McCarthy when he began accusing high members of the military forces, "Have you left no sense of decency?" In 1954, the hearings ceased, but it wasn't until 1975 that the House of Un-American Activities Committee was abolished. So, hopefully you've learned a little bit about not only the Salem witch trials, but also about the McCarthy Red Scare. You can look at the questions again, see if you're now able to answer them. And this background context will help you understand the Crucible if you choose to read the play or watch the movie. In Act 1, you're going to encounter the narrator, Tituba, Paris, Abigail, Susanna, Mrs. Putnam, and Mr. Putnam. Some girls in this Puritan village are going to be doing some very inappropriate things, dancing in the forest, and we all know what the forest represents. See what unfolds, enjoy the story, enjoy the movie.